Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air.
Good evening. This is Dr. Dan, and this is Freedom Forum Live, streamed every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. My guest tonight is Dr. Bose Ravenel, now retired after a 49-year medical career, which included 31 years private practice, 11 years academic pediatrics, and concluding with 6.5 years integrative medicine. He studied vaccinology intensively over the final 15 years, and we will discuss the risks of childhood vaccination, the profit motive of Big Pharma from childhood vaccinations, and the immorality of vaccine mandates. So, Dr. Ravenel, welcome as a guest on Freedom Forum Live.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, Mark Twain, who's an iconic figure in American literature, was deeply skeptical about the use of statistics to manipulate and distort the truth in order to promote specific agendas. So famously, he said, there are three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And that's where the title for tonight's program comes from. So tonight, Dr. Ravenel and I are going to take a deep dive into the use of lies, damn lies, and statistics used to justify putting all of us, especially our children, at risk for serious illness and untimely death from forced vaccinations, all to increase profits from Big Pharma. Historically, one of our founding fathers, Dr. Joseph Warren, is credited with curing smallpox by vaccination techniques in the Boston colony prior to the American War of Independence. Older Americans are familiar with vaccination for smallpox and tetanus, but now we are faced with a veritable onslaught of vaccinations for diseases we all had and lived through. Even worse, our government is intent on forcing all of us to submit to their vaccination requirements that clearly violate our individual freedom and the ownership of our own bodies. Dr. Ravenel, let's get started. You know, they claim that they are scientists. So wouldn't it be appropriate to start with a little discussion of the scientific method? What does the scientific method include? And more importantly, are they actually using the scientific method?
Yeah, the scientific method is, first of all, depends upon open discourse and questioning any and everything. In fact, that's almost the definition of science, is looking at data, available information data, analyzing it, try to determine what is true and what isn't. And then the most valuable part of that is having dialogue where people question. That's why you have peer reviewers for papers before papers are accepted in the journals. And then in the case of what we're talking about, there's an unprecedented, in my 49 years career, plus about 15 years now having retired, I have witnessed the most extraordinary conflicting streams of information about any and every subject you can imagine, polar opposite dialogues. And now we have AI on top of all that. So it's going to make it even more difficult to determine fantasy from reality. But the scientific, the problem that I see is that in the current medical world is dominated by corporatization, bureaucratic organization, control from the top down. Insurance companies, physicians are no longer have the power to make decisions with their patients. So the physician and the patient depend on insurance companies or medical organizations, and there are huge financial vested interest in the arena of vaccines.
So you have some papers that you have a lot of papers that you've written specifically on this subject. So let's get into the meat of our discussion. What do you mean by efficacy and effectiveness? Relative risk reduction versus absolute risk reduction. That's
Well,
really where they kind of fool us, isn't it? Because I think some of these numbers look pretty suspect to me. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, it's the concept of absolute versus relative risk reduction. I was myself unaware of all this until about 10 years ago, 6 years, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And I'm holding in my hand a reference to a document published by the government. And the best way to explain it, let's assume that 10,000 individuals receive a placebo injection, inert dummy. Another 10,000 are given a dose of vaccine for COVID-19. And the number of new infections from the virus is determined over the next 4 months by a PCR test in both groups. Assume that there are 100 cases of infection in the placebo group versus 10 in the treatment group. Now, the following statistics are both accurate. The relative risk reduction would be 90%, similar to the, quote, 95% we've all heard about the efficacy. Efficacy always means relative risk reduction. That's why all you ever hear is efficacy. But the absolute risk reduction in this hypothetical case is 90 cases prevented of 10,000 given the vaccine, which is 9 per 1,000 or 0.9%. And in fact, when I made up these hypothetical numbers, I didn't even realize until I looked at the Pfizer data in the much fought after data finally released by the FDA as they tried to delay it for 75 years. In a paper describing this, Ronald Brown actually published an article showing how selective reporting of vaccine efficacy by using RRR instead of absolute gives an illusion of effectiveness. And the Pfizer vaccine, the relative risk reduction was 95.1%. The corresponding absolute risk reduction was 0.7%. So the real important informed consent type information, the benefit was less than 1%. You treat 100 people with all the risk to theoretically prevent one case of a cold. It turns out that COVID-19, another aside, is nothing more now than 20% of all colds in the last 40 years have been coronavirus.
So what you're actually saying here is that they, like we said in the beginning, they're using statistics to lie to us. They give us numbers. Those numbers, in our minds, they indicate something that is not actual science. For the Pfizer vaccine, they can claim that the relative risk reduction was 95%. But in truth, out of 100 patients, they only protected one out of those 100. The Moderna vaccine was very similar, 94.1% relative compared to the actual risk reduction of 1.1%. Both vaccines basically fell into the same pot of lies. We thinking here, okay, we're going to have a 95% reduction of our individual risk. That's just not the case at all. So they use those to say, you better get your vaccine because here's what we can do for you. But in essence, they're putting all those people at risk just to save one. Isn't that true?
And to even show you how it applied to influenza, typically flu vaccines each annual year. Again, these figures are always, I've never seen ever presentation of data that isn't efficacy, which is relative risk reduction. And the flu vaccine may be 50, 60, 70%. Well, if 90% is 0.7% absolute, a 50% efficacy is basically worthless completely. And now they're even, some of the COVID boosters supposedly have 30% efficacy. It's almost comical if it weren't such a serious, tragic misapplication of data.
So for the recommended childhood vaccines, there's just no direct comparisons between vaccinated and unvaccinated groups. And you talked about the scientific method. The scientific method means you have a theory, you design an experiment to see whether that theory works, you collect your data, and then you evaluate the data. But in the testing that was done for these vaccines, was there actually an unvaccinated group that they compared things to? How did they come up with those numbers that said that the vaccines actually worked?
Yeah, one has to be aware of several facts that are all equally important. The first one is that the regular vaccine recommended schedule for the CDC in recent years, there has never been, not one of the vaccines has ever had a true test against an inert placebo compared to the vaccine for safety or efficacy, not one. Number two, I lost my train of thought.
Well, so what you're saying, not a single vaccine had a test that showed it was better than the unvaccinated group. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. And the government has never done a placebo or compared vaccinated and unvaccinated. And the excuse they give, it would be unethical. I mean, it's a joke. It's a circular argument. It'd be unethical to do a placebo-controlled trial because of the benefits for the vaccines that have already been established. But they haven't been established. They've never done a study. So they won't do the study, so they can't have the data, but they won't do it because it's unethical, because of the risk to the people that they're going to miss out on the benefit of the vaccine, which they haven't shown. So it's a circular, it's a joke, really.
So you gave me some information about a pediatrician named Paul Thomas, who published some data from his integrative pediatric practice in Portland, Oregon. What did that tell us about vaccines?
Yes, Paul published a book that 4 or 5 years ago that I devoured, one of the best books I've ever read about holistic care of children. And in it, he presented the data for his integrative practice. He had a more recent version, Facts, which I'm holding up right here. This particular book, he presents all the data. Every patient, he was facing pressure because he gave parents the right to make their own choice after informed consent as to whether to take all the vaccines, none of them, some of them, whatever. And then after a total, I think, some 15 years, the government basically put pressure on him and demanded that if he's going to retain his license, he produce data to prove that his unvaccinated patients were not suffering consequences from not being vaccinated. So in response to that, he got an independent researcher to do an analysis of every patient in his practice, not selecting every single patient. They got the data for 15 years and analyzed it. And what came out, they used 15 measures of number of office visits for 15 categories of chronic health problems in children. And in every single one of the 15 areas, the unvaccinated children fared dramatically better, 2 and 3 times better off than the vaccinated. So every one of the 15. And then the book Vax, Unvaxxed, non-government sources compiled over 100 studies of various sorts, including questionnaires, surveys done by different people, not the government, vaccinated, unvaccinated, and all 100 of them show that unvaccinated are healthier than the vaccinated. In fact, in Paul Thomas's Vax, Unvaxxed, most recently, vaccines and the diseases they target came out from the physicians for informed consent. And they have it here, almost all the vaccines on the recommended pediatric vaccines on the schedule. And they compared the data from the government on the risk of death from the illnesses, the viruses that the vaccines target, with the rate of death from the vaccines, from government data. and half the ones they got, that some of them they didn't have enough data to say which was less or more. But the only ones that they had data from both the vaccine risk of death and the viral risk of death, in every case, the risk of death from the vaccine from government data is higher than the risk of death from the illness.
Well, we all know when it came to COVID, there was plenty of data which said that children were the least susceptible to the disease and the least likely to have any serious complications. And yet they continual push, vaccinate the kids, vaccinate the kids, vaccinate the kids, without one single shred of evidence that was something that should be done. As a matter of fact, the evidence, common sense evidence, said that's the last group of people that you should be vaccinating, the ones who are least susceptible to the disease. So what goes on with that? I mean, what is going on when you get something like that?
In the COVID vaccine, speaking of that, the mRNA and the related vaccines, I had the experience of being asked to be an expert witness for a mother who was in a courtroom, a domestic court contested battle between father and mother. Father wanted the two teenage boys receive a COVID vaccine. The mother was proposed that they didn't want to take it, and she wanted them not to. The judge was known to be pushing the parents to settle and have them vaccinated. And within about 24 hours before the scheduled appearance in the courtroom, the evening before, after the attorney and the opposing counsel had an opportunity to review the white paper, the research on which we based our testimony, they basically conceded and just gave up. There's no data or any rational argument to justify giving an mRNA shot to any child for any purpose. It just is none.
So, this really brings up the question of all those other vaccines that they're trying to force into our children. When I was young, obviously, we all got measles, we all got whooping cough, and we all got the mumps and chicken pox. And when some kid in the neighborhood had the chicken pox, they had a party, brought all the kids over, and we all got chicken pox together. Didn't really do anything bad to any of us, but nowadays they have vaccines against all that. Is that really necessary, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great point. No, I agree with you. I remember also, and it's interesting that even the mainstream that's pushing all the vaccines will admit that if you had measles as a child before 1957, you have lifetime immunity. Lifetime. Measles, on the other hand, vaccines, in the face of a flood of hysteria about, there's measles cases. The measles, when they say it's eradicated, it's a euphemism. Measles never been eradicated. There are always cases. It's just they arbitrarily declared that if you have fewer than, I don't know what the number is, some say 10,000 or something in a year, it's called eradicated. But about 6 or 8 years ago, I did a paper and found 3 or 4 documented outbreaks of measles in communities around the country. And the percentage of the kids who had been fully vaccinated was 95 to 100% in several of them. So the vaccine is very imperfect, not long lasting. It does reduce the incidence of measles, but it's a temporary immunity.
So in reality, what you found is that it really does no good, because, as you said, I had measles. I've got immunity for the rest of my life. So why? And I understand there are some people who do have problems with measles. It's like any disease. Some people do have serious problems, but the vast majority do not. So what we're doing is forcing vaccinations on people. And I know that you also studied that the timing of this push for vaccinations and then the claim that it's reducing the incidence of disease is another fake study, another fake statistic. Isn't that true?
Yes, it is. And there are all kinds of ways that happens. And I'll go back to the COVID case, and for several years, it was argued that the popular pro-vaccine propaganda, I call it because it's what it was that it was the idea that if the unvaccinated, people who are dying and people who are hospitalized are unvaccinated. Well, there are two things that were done that produced an illusion of that. Number one, the CDC arbitrarily defined and declared that if you received a COVID vaccine, you were considered and counted unvaccinated for 14 days after the vaccine. So if you dropped dead or you had a stroke or you had whatever, for 14 days, and think about it, when are you most likely to have overwhelming serious reactions? Within 14 days. So they reclassified just arbitrarily into the first, so they eliminated basically most of the real vaccinated people and called them unvaccinated. It's like the border's closed, but there is a video with millions of people streaming across the border. It's the same thing. And then they also had the PCR test that Kerry Mullis, who invented the test and developed it before his death, about 4 videos I have on my computer, where he said up until about 3 months before the pandemic broke out, when he died tragically, that he warned that PCR cannot establish the presence or absence of any diagnosis of an infection, none. And they're still using it after 6 years. It's the biggest fraud in the history of medicine by itself. So how many deaths that were called from COVID, but were not from COVID, they were something else. Motorcycle accidents, all kind of other things in the hospital. They do a COVID test, quote, PCR, positive test. Some hospitals, whistleblowers have shown that in some cases, hospitals would run tests and they kept running them day after day after day and finally get a positive. And guess what? It was a huge reimbursement benefit for all aspects of COVID care in a hospital. I read somewhere that the amount of money that a COVID diagnosis for someone who ended up doing intensive care and then died was something like $237,000.
Wow.
And then I had friends say, well, money wouldn't make an influence.
Well, I can tell you that's definitely not the case, and you know it as well as I do. And you've just given us some really good evidence that is the case. You know, obviously, one of the things we really need to talk about is what evidence is there about the harms from vaccines? What have you got to say about that?
Well, if one looks at the data, this is all data. I don't have the data, but physician-informed consent review, this is government data. All of it in there is government data. Paul Thomas's data, it's data, scientific research. And the results are unambiguous. They can't find any evidence that any of the vaccines on the regular childhood schedule, again, they have Suzanne Humphries in her classic book, Dissolving Illusions, which really opened my mind to these 25 years ago. If I'd heard what I'm saying tonight, I would have said, this is impossible. Well, it is true. It's true. But she showed that most of the illnesses we're talking about, the number of the deaths from these different diseases had decreased by 93 to 98% before the vaccines for them ever came out. And so that's conveniently overlooked.
So there also was a Supreme Court case in 2011. I guess it's Brucewitz versus Wyeth. It affirmed, that's the case that affirmed the liability shield for pharmaceutical company manufacturers and prescribing medical professionals established in the 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And it stipulated in that act that, and the words of the Supreme Court, that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. Now, who would want? So, who wants to get injected with something that's unavoidably unsafe?
And in the face of that, they still say vaccines are, quote, unqualified Safe and effective. That is absolutely, it's the greatest euphemism that's ever been created. And they still have the gall to say it today. It's beyond comprehension. The vaccine, National Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund that underreports by 99%, according to the government-funded Pilgrim study. They said that only 1 out of 100 actual adverse events are even reported. And the amount of money paid out from once the vaccine companies had no liability, the amount of money exceeded $5 billion with a B dollars in a court process where the plaintiff has no attorney. It's a government-appointed attorney who takes the case. It's a special master in the court, in the quote court. It's not a standard courtroom. And the amount of time it takes is years. It's a lot of money. And the compensation, despite all the burdens of going through that process, $5 billion, and these are safe and effective. I mean, it's like the border is sealed when there are thousands of people every day pouring in. It's the same thing.
Well, we should get to discuss the American Academy of Pediatrics. You sent me some articles. One was called Mining Children for Profit. And the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, has been very stridently insistent that children should be injected with the COVID virus, even knowing as early as 2020 that severe COVID-19 was very rare in healthy children. So here is a group of physicians, the American Academy of Pediatrics, again coming out and publicly saying we need to do something which they already know should not be done. That is really terrifying to me.
Yes, indeed. To remove they've been fighting tooth and nail with lawyers and everything else, desperately trying to get even the exemptions, religious exemptions. They want them not to be allowed at all. I mean, that is just unconscionable. I don't know what word there is for it. It's beyond comprehension. And I'm a lifetime fellow of the organization. And the AAP, I joined it many, many years ago. And it was some great people. There still are some great people in it. But somehow enough of the people who are in leadership positions have steered it astray.
I understand that the AAP also has their primary priority is to remove parents from any authority when it comes to decisions on whether to inject their children with various substances produced commercially by its sponsors. Isn't that true?
Yes, it is. And there have been numerous articles published recently where there are several countries now have started banning some vaccines. There are hundreds of thousands of medical professionals around the world who have joined Dr. Peter McCullough and others, Robert Malone and others, who have been calling now seriously and presenting data time after time after time. It's all based on data. And not only no vested, I've always said if people are having a hard time determining which of two diametrically opposed perspectives is more likely correct, are there vested interest on either side? On the side of pushing the vaccines and removing exemptions in the face of all these things we're talking about, the vested interest for the people who are pushing them, there are immense. I mean, the amount of money is astronomical. We could talk all night about that. It's obvious. The government's committed billions of dollars to promote them. But the people who have been blowing the whistle, telling the truth, opposing this gargantuan push to vaccinate everything and everybody, what are their vested interests? Well, what happens is they get the license taken away, or they lose their practice, or they go bankrupt. So which one's more likely to be telling the truth?
Well, to be honest with you, I would like to I would like to go back to some of these things about the COVID vaccine, because a lot of us have questions about that vaccine and about vaccines in general. So the COVID vaccine was what they would call an mRNA vaccine. There have been reports that mRNA is showing up in people's DNA. Is that true?
Well, I don't know that we can say it is true clinically as far as autopsy, all that, but they have cultured liver cells, human liver cells, and they have detected presence of it's either nanoparticles or the RNA in the liver cells in a human. And then there are some recent reports suggesting that it is very likely that there is some form of DNA incorporation. There's also DNA contamination of a lot of these vials of vaccine, that gets into the theory. The scientific theory is that if you have DNA contamination, this is a process that can lead to affecting all kinds of things, including the ability of the body to monitor its own, so inducing the risk for autoimmune diseases and cancer. And that leads into a whole other thing about the explosion of what's now called turbo cancers, which are all over the world, are just exploding, coinciding with the mRNA platform shots.
You know, that's a very good point that you just brought up, because it seems to me that we're reading about a lot of young people dying young. I can't remember in my lifetime reports of so many young, supposedly healthy people who getting fatal disease, a lot of them cancer, to be honest with you, and dying early in life. There's also a problem with blood clots after the COVID vaccine. So here we are, all of a sudden, we have issues like heart-related issues like myocarditis caused from the COVID vaccine, cancers from the COVID vaccine. What do you think is causing that? What in that vaccine is likely to be the cause of untimely death of young people?
Well, first of all, they based the vaccine on the spike protein component of the viral particle. And the problem is that the component of the virus itself that is responsible for the majority of the pathological effects of it is, guess what? It's the spike protein. So they've developed it's actually technically not a vaccine. It's actually technically a genetic therapy shot, investigational genetic therapy. So the CDC actually, I don't want to forget this point. The CDC arbitrarily, somewhere back several years ago, just all of a sudden declared that the definition of a vaccine has changed. Well, who changed it? Who asked the CDC to change the definition of vaccine? So they changed the definition of vaccine to anything that stimulates the immune system. So in that case, vitamin D and herbal things, medicinal mushrooms, they're all vaccines. It's nuts. It's preposterous. So the vaccine, they call the quote vaccines. They are not vaccines. They're literally genetic therapy shots because they induce the individual who receives it, their body to produce the protein, which then stimulates the reaction of the antibodies forming. And that's where the devil with the details, because as the antibodies attack the spike protein, number one, the distribution, biodistribution, where does the spike protein go after it's shot? What they told us was it'll stay in your shoulder. It's localized. The mRNA won't last. Until now, they've demonstrated up to 3 years after the last shot, still finding mRNA, restoring spike protein. I know several people, myself, who had vaccines and maybe only had 2 doses. They never got a booster. It's been 2 or 3 years, and their spike protein level, it's so common now, a problem, that LabCorp has a spike protein determination lab test. And some of these people I know personally have a spike protein level of 20,000. If it's over 1,000, it's abnormal. It's even higher than getting the illness from the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself.
So the spike protein is obviously a problem. And there is a test that people can get to find out whether they have it still circulating around. Is there a way to get rid of it? Is there something you can do to get rid of the spike protein?
Well, fortunately, some of the people that I call the independent medical physicians around the country, among which I would say Dr. Peter McCullough is one of the most well-known and most remarkable. Dr. McCullough, by the way, for those who are not aware, is one of the most credentialed cardiologists in the world, not the United States, the world, published experience with cardiology, but also in treating COVID. And he was instrumental in doing some of the first published papers ever published about early ambulatory treatment with repurposed, FDA-approved, safe drugs like ivermectin, vitamin D, quercetin, herbal things, and so forth. These are things, and they're very effective. Ivermectin is one of the most effective prevention and treatment modalities that there is in the country, in the world. Some of the areas like Uttar Pradesh in India, they gave out ivermectin to the citizens, and they had no COVID problem at the time. And in some parts of Africa, countries that actually have not had a high vaccine uptake, but had a lot of ivermectin uptake, didn't have much problem with the COVID problem. And yet what happened in our country, what we saw was the government and the medical industry, the organized medicine, was literally fighting against people using ivermectin. There's a book, The War on Ivermectin. There's a website. There are books and websites about it, and still to this day, it's being debated and argued. If you look at the data, it's overwhelming. It's one of the safest, most effective drugs we have.
Absolutely. But what you bring up is a really important point, that the COVID in our country was a political disease. That's what it was.
Yes, in fact, what I just said about the ivermectin and the fighting against it, you have to also be aware of this fact. The emergency use authorization basis for the COVID shots until recently was exclusively initially and then mostly EUA, emergency use authorization. Under EUA, they are not, the liabilities wavered a different way. But under EUA, if there is an available alternative treatment, you cannot get EUA authorization. So all the money involved in COVID hinged on no available treatment. So do you think that's why? Pharmacists were told not to fill it when doctors prescribed it? That should have been a criminal offense for a pharmacist to decline. That's practicing medicine without a license, it seems to me.
Well, it is a criminal offense because many people who might be alive are not alive now. Exactly. because treatments were available that we all knew in the popular press. We all knew there were treatments that were successful, like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. Those are things that everyone was saying, oh, if you get COVID, you start taking ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and you won't, if you get COVID, well, you won't be as sick as you were, and you won't end up in a hospital on a respirator. And that was probably true, undoubtedly true. But there was a war on those medicines for obvious reasons. COVID was a political disease. It was a political disease during an election year. And there were probably some other things we can speculate about why COVID was allowed to run rampant and why we were prevented from getting proper treatments. I'm not going to get into speculations on that, but there's no question that when you take just the plain medical facts, is we were denied the ability to get treatment that most or many doctors knew were in fact effective. That is worse than criminal. That is absolutely
a practice that I was in my last 6 years of integrative medicine. And within that practice, they had several thousand patients, including those many who are my age, which means they were very senior in some categories, old age, and they got sick. And they had people who got real sick, and they treated with ivermectin and all these other things, the vitamin D and the other things, all kind of integrative things. But they didn't get hospitalized. Nobody died. They only had 3 of them went in the hospital. And then while people who were told don't go to the hospital until you're about ready to die, it's a surprise, almost all the COVID deaths were in hospitals because they were suppressed early treatment. And then when you showed up, and that gets into giving the hospital protocols that included the drug called remdesivir, which prior to the COVID pandemic was known in the case of using remdesivir, as I recall, it was something to do with Ebola, using in another disease. Something like 45% of the people that took the drug died. And then the hospitals, people who were put on remdesivir, which became part of the hospital protocol, sometimes even when patients said they did not want to take it, because the word spread about the risk of that particular drug, the nurses actually, some of the whistleblower nurses called it run death is near because of the horrific rate of side effects of that drug. And so hospital protocols were, unfortunately, tragically, instrumental in the death of a lot of people.
So why is it that the COVID vaccines today have not been pulled completely? They are obviously lethal. They are unproven. They do not protect you from anything. They're being forced on people who absolutely don't need it anyway. Why are they still around?
I don't know. It's beyond me. There's so many medical professionals in the independent world across the world calling for removal from the market completely for all mRNA vaccines that should be taken off today.
You know, recently RFK Jr. removed mercury from the influenza vaccine. Why was it there in the first place? Or in any vaccine to begin with?
Yeah. Talking about mercury?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was there. It's part of the things they put in it to ensure sterility as a sterilizing agent. Problem is you may remember, I think if you were like me, I remember breaking a thermometer, an old mercury thermometer back in childhood, and thinking it was fun to roll the little balls of mercury. Obviously, that's a huge risk. Mercury is one of the most toxic things there is on planet Earth. And it's instrumental. It's a horrific and dangerous product.
You know, while we're on the subject of vaccines, which is obviously what we've been talking about, what is your opinion about the connection to autism and vaccines? The incidence of autism obviously has been rising quite a bit. In the 60s and 70s, it was about 1 in 2,500. By 2000, it was 1 in 250. By 2020, it's 1 in 36. Is there a correlation between that exponential increase in childhood vaccinations and autism?
Yes, of course there is. And I'm glad you asked me that question. In my integrated 6 years, I had ended up with about 30 or 40 children who had autism. The first of whom was a child, about 3 or 4, who suffered a tremendous adverse situation with the ER in the community hospital nearby here. And the parents came to me for consultation because he had developed what the neuro specialist at the hospital where he was treated for a week and evaluated. The specialist told the parents, your child has had an autistic regression from MMR vaccine. And don't give them another one unless somebody recommends they do it. So they came to me to get my opinion, and I strongly encourage them not to give any further MMR vaccine or any other vaccine for that matter in this particular case. But I had 40 to 50 kids with autism. A number of them had vaccine injuries. And it turns out that Mary Holland, an attorney and author of a book, has worked with RFK Jr. a lot over the years. She published an article in Pace Communications several years ago. She had studied and found some 33 cases of autism that were children with autism, and traced them through the process when they all went to vaccine court. And none of them were conceded to have autism from vaccines, but they did have 30-some cases where the child was deemed, in terms of causation, to have experienced encephalopathy caused by vaccines. And then they got a determination of eligibility for some award because of that. But the encephalopathy then resulted in autism. And the autism became the basis for the kind of treatment provided. And so they said, but the spin was, and still is, the vaccine didn't cause autism. The vaccine caused encephalopathy, which then caused the autism. And that gives you an idea. And then finally, Dr. Zimmerman and Dr. Kelly, both from Johns Hopkins, have put out an affidavit in the last 6 months. I have one of them's copy right here. They were favored expert witnesses for the government in these contested vaccine autism cases that were part of the omnibus autism proceedings that the government held. And they until recent years, there was a case of a Dr. Poling, whose own child at Johns Hopkins developed autism after having had MMR vaccines in a setting of mitochondrial deficiency. And so after those cases were done, the polling case in the vaccine court was never adjudicated, but they made a settlement. And part of the settlement was to, on the one hand, they did award, I think $1 million or more. It was a financial award for autism caused by vaccines in a case with underlying mitochondrial dysfunction. And but the case was, since it was settled, the non-disclosure agreement was part of it. So it's never been part of the public record, but it's been documented. In fact, Dr. Zimmerman's affidavit, publicly released about 3 months ago, I have a copy of it right here, describes all this in great detail. And he points out that in a previous case, the Cedillo case, adjudicated in the vaccine court, he had expressed the opinion then that vaccines don't in themselves cause autism, at least in the case of the Cedillo case. But when he made that decision, he actually stipulated and said, I want to be sure, make it clear that I'm not saying vaccine can cause autism. That's not what it was in this case. But then later on, his affidavit said he is convinced, and Dr. Kelly did the same thing, his own affidavit, publicly stating that vaccines can cause autism in their opinion. And they were the two leading government experts for years in the vaccine court, until, of course, they changed their opinion based on the data.
You know, in our time now, there are more and more people, more and more parents, I should say, who understand and firmly believe that the vaccines that are being thrust upon their children are dangerous, that the risks far outweigh any possible benefits. And there are doctors that understand that as well. How do those parents and how do those doctors protect themselves from the government agencies and the government bureaucrats who are intent upon forcing vaccination upon us? What do we do?
I think the only thing I know is to continue, as we are doing tonight, to publicly talk about the benefits and risks. And in the case of what we're talking about, the routine childhood vaccines, and especially the mRNA shots for COVID, in these cases, first of all, they're not shown to be safe. They are shown to be actually highly dangerous overall. Now, if the benefits were great enough, you could argue they'd be worth it. But no one's done that because they haven't studied any of them against a true saline placebo.
Well, our discussion tonight has obviously shown that there are true risks to the COVID vaccine. And it has also shown that the childhood disease vaccines are of useless. Most of those diseases, according to the data you showed me, most of those diseases were decreasing in frequency to the point as when the vaccines were introduced. Those diseases were already on their decline in terms of numbers. So here you have some pediatricians and also government agencies and the like saying, you got to do this to your children. I'm sure there are children who are being denied entrance to schools and things like that, or being denied the ability to participate in childhood activities because of that. How do you fight that? What do parents do and what do doctors do in order to say, no, it is my right to protect my children. Their bodies belong to them and to me as that when they're children, and my body belongs to me as an adult, and I don't want those substances in it. How do we do that?
I think first of all, I will never advise anybody as a retired physician to take or not take any vaccine. We're talking here tonight, and I will continue to talk about what the data shows in terms of informed consent. I believe passionately in the old-fashioned primum non nocere. First, do no harm. Number two is informed consent. The standard prevailing process of giving information to parents in pediatric offices is not informed consent. It's basically, because it's a vaccine information sheet produced by the drug company, it does not mention some of the most serious consequences, exaggerates, minimizes risk. And then many of the pediatricians or physicians they're overwhelmed with the pressures and burdens of bureaucracy, all the data they've got to accumulate, all the records they've got to keep and all that. And so unfortunately, they don't take the time, can't really justify taking the time to sit down and answer the questions. In fact, more and more of them nowadays are doing what I view as an unconscionable thing to do, which is to tell a parent that if you won't take these vaccines, I won't see your child. To me, that's an unconscionable, unprofessional decision. And the AAP used to be opposed to that, but now is actually not opposed to it at all, which is horrifying to me.
Well, informed consent is really the basis for freedom, your own individual freedom, your ability to say, I own my body, and what happens to it is under my own control. The government doesn't like that, does it?
No. And as far as your question about, a good question, what is a parent to do who does look at the data? And I found that in my integrative practice, many of my patients became more informed than I was about a lot of things. And I learned when first day in med school, I was told that 50% of what you will be taught is true is wrong. We don't know which half it is. And so I've never had any trouble at all listening to parents. And I've had time and time again, I still learn from parents. They'll ask me questions. God, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. I'll look it up. And I found time and time again, these parents, a lot of the parents, autistic kids' parents, knew more about vaccines than I knew at the time. And I guarantee they knew more than most physicians in practice because they hadn't had time to read about them. So I think for parents who really are struggling with what to do, I just recommend these sources we're talking about. The government data behind the physician-informed consent, taking the government's own figures, and then the book by Paul Thomas, Vax Facts, goes over all the vaccines on the schedule, all the data about his experience of the outcomes of the kids that were unvaccinated. And for those people who want a source that goes over, if they want to do, they just can't bring themselves not to vaccinate at all, then his first book, which was The Vaccine Friendly Plan, is when he had more patients who were partially vaccinated and all that. And so he has a lot of useful information there about the pros and cons and the risks and benefits and all. But parents can get very informed and make a very sophisticated decision. I think the main thing is to realize it's certainly appropriate and rational, and certainly fine with me if a parent's truly informed and want to have all the vaccines. Fine, go for it. On the other hand, if a parent decides is fully informed and they decide that their child's better off with no vaccines at all, in my opinion, that's a rational decision that can be made.
Well, you've come and had a discussion with us tonight based on many years active in pediatrics. You're dealing with, in many ways, the most vulnerable segment of our population. Do you have some final words that you'd like to give us about what you've learned in all of those years that is of importance to all of us to hear?
I've learned to listen to mamas and daddies. I've learned to just to be honest with them, that they can handle it. To be open and it just to do the way medicine was when I first started out was largely much more this way than it is, because doctors, they just don't have control over anything practically. They almost have to follow protocols, and protocol by definition doesn't allow you to make any rational judgments. And that's what's lacking, making rational decisions and judgments and true informed consent. If we just get back to true informed consent and prima non nocere, do things that are best for the patient, there's nothing new here under the sun. It's just that's the way I can put it.
I think that's very wise advice, and I certainly have found in my practice that discussing things with patients is the most important thing you can do. But I understand, and I know you do too, that medicine is only part science. Medicine is art. And that's the major battle that we are going to be facing in the future now, as AI comes into the picture, as younger physicians come in who don't understand, who are more focused on numbers than patients.
Yeah.
That's really important to me, and I'm sure it's important to you as well, is when you see a patient and you know what to do because you've seen it 1,000 times before and you know what works. The insurance company says you're not going to do that, but you know it works. I'm going to do it every time because I'm smarter than any insurance company, and I know you are too.
Dr. Fred Klenner in 1949 reported to JAMA, presented and published in JAMA, 49 consecutive patients with poliomyelitis that he treated with high-dose vitamin C, 40 to 50 grams a day, and not one paralysis or one death in the patients. He was 70 years ahead of his time.
Well, Dr. Ravenel, we've had an incredible discussion, and I know it's important to an awful lot of people. This is a very important topic because many people who are listening have children, and they're afraid. They're afraid of having something dangerous injected into the body of their children. They want their children to live and be healthy, and that does not necessarily involve the injection of vaccines. That can be very risky. So I want to thank you very much for being a guest on Freedom Forum Live. We've covered probably some of the most important things we can talk about. Thank you very much, and I think we may see you back again because I don't think we've scratched the surface with you yet.
It's been an honor to be on here, and I look forward to possible future discussions.
Thank you, sir. You have a great evening.
All right.